In the heart of Europe, the city of Krakow stands as a monument to history. Its ancient streets have witnessed centuries of turmoil and triumph, its stone walls echoing with stories of kings, artists, survivors. As the millennium drew to a close, Poland was a nation in transition, embracing a new era of freedom while still grappling with the shadows of its past. The late 1990s were a time of cautious optimism, yet beneath the surface of this vibrant, evolving city, a dark current was about to stir. The 6th of January, 1999. In Poland, this day marks the Feast of the Epiphany, a time of quiet celebration. But on this particular day, the winter air over Krakow carried a biting chill. On the water, the crew of the tugboat Elk went about their duties. Their work was routine, a series of familiar tasks performed against the backdrop of the city's slumbering skyline. The day progressed, and the boat's engine began to signal a problem. The propeller, the powerful heart of the vessel, was laboring. It was fouled, entangled with something substantial. For the crew, this was an expected if frustrating part of the job. They prepared to inspect the machinery, assuming they would find a tangled fishing net or a heavy log. What they were about to find, however, was not mundane. It was not something the river gives up lightly. As they pulled the object from the water, the initial confusion slowly hardened into a dawning, chilling realization. What they had retrieved was not inanimate debris. It was organic. More than that, it was human skin. Forensic analysis would later confirm the crew's initial dreadful impression. The skin had been carefully dissected. It had been handled with a chilling precision. Later reports would reveal an even more unsettling detail. The skin appeared to have been fashioned to be worn, almost like a piece of clothing. The crew immediately contacted the authorities. The discovery on the Elk had opened the first chapter of a case that would defy explanation for nearly 2 decades. For the Krakow police, the grim discovery in the Vistula River presented an immediate and formidable challenge. The first priority was to give the victim back her name. Without an identity, a face, or a history, the case was an anonymous tragedy, a set of horrifying facts with no human story attached. The investigation could not truly begin until they knew who she was. Detectives initiated a comprehensive search of missing persons reports, not just from Krakow, but from across the region. In an era before fully integrated national databases, this was painstaking analog work. It meant manually sifting through stacks of paper files, cross-referencing details by hand, and making endless phone calls to other precincts. Every report of a missing woman had to be meticulously reviewed and considered, a process that consumed hundreds of man-hours. The pressure was immense, compounded by a lack of any distinguishing features on the remains themselves. Simultaneously, the recovered evidence was rushed under a strict chain of custody to the city's forensic laboratories. In 1999, DNA testing was a world away from the rapid, automated process it is today. It was a delicate, time-consuming craft. Scientists began the methodical work of extracting a viable genetic profile from the degraded tissue, a task fraught with difficulty. The techniques available, like restriction fragment length polymorphism, required larger, better quality samples and could take weeks or even months to yield a result. Every step was critical. A single error could compromise the only definitive link to the victim's identity. As fragmented details of the case began to leak to the press, a wave of horror and disbelief washed over Krakow. The city, known for its rich history and cultural vibrancy, was suddenly confronted by a crime of unimaginable brutality. The public's reaction was one of profound shock, fracturing the community's sense of safety and leaving citizens to wonder who could be capable of such an act. After weeks of dead ends, a potential breakthrough emerged. Investigators began to focus on the case of a 23-year-old university student who had vanished without a trace a few months earlier, in November of 1998. Her name was Katarzyna Z. The timeline and circumstances of her disappearance made her a person of high interest in the investigation. Katarzyna was a student of religious studies at the prestigious Jagiellonian University. Described by her family as bright, kind, but deeply sensitive, she'd been navigating a difficult period in her life. She was reportedly struggling with depression and had recently been granted a leave of absence from her studies following the death of her father, which had affected her profoundly. To ask a family already tormented by the agony of uncertainty to provide a DNA sample is to ask them to confront their absolute worst fears. It is a moment suspended between a desperate hope for reunion and the dread of confirmation. With quiet courage, Katarzyna's mother provided a sample to the police, a small act imbued with a mother's love and unbearable apprehension. The wait for the lab was agonizing. When the results finally came back, they were conclusive. The DNA from the victim was a match to Katarzyna's mother. The anonymous victim was confirmed to be Katarzyna Z. The discovery finally had a name, a face, and a family left to grieve an incomprehensible loss. With her identity confirmed, the case transformed. It was no longer an abstract, horrifying event discussed in hushed tones across the city, but the tragic, violent end of a specific, beloved person. A daughter, a friend, a student with a future that had been stolen from her. The confirmation of Katarzyna's identity should have been the key to unlocking the case. Instead, it led to a wall of silence. Despite a massive investigative effort, re-interviewing friends and family, canvassing her last known locations, and making public appeals for information, the trail went cold. No one had any credible information about where she went after she was last seen. No witnesses came forward. It was as if she had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Faced with a crime of unprecedented savagery and a complete lack of leads, Polish authorities took the highly unusual step of consulting with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The profilers in Quantico, studying the scant evidence, built the profile of a killer who was intelligent, calculating, and likely possessed specialist anatomical skills. Perhaps a butcher, a surgeon, or someone who had worked in forensic medicine. They believed the killer was likely a recluse, someone who could operate unseen on the fringes of society. Armed with this profile, investigators pursued several persons of interest. They questioned individuals with medical training, workers from abattoirs, and others whose professions matched the grim skill set required. But each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Alibis were confirmed, searches yielded nothing, and no physical evidence could be found to link any of them to Katarzyna's disappearance or death. The net had been cast wide, but it came up empty every time. Weeks of intense investigation turned into months, and months bled into years. The case, once a national obsession that dominated headlines and conversations, slowly receded from the public consciousness. The files grew thicker, but the answers remained out of reach. Katarzyna Z's murder entered a long, quiet winter of its own, becoming one of Poland's most infamous cold cases. The silence, deafening for those who loved her, would last for nearly 2 decades. But during those long years of silence, forensic science and policing in Poland were quietly modernizing. In 2014, this evolution took a concrete form in Krakow with the official establishment of Archiwum X, Archive X. This was an elite cold case unit, comprised of the force's most experienced detectives, criminologists, and analysts. Their sole mission, to deploy new technology and fresh eyes to re-examine the region's most difficult and unsolvable crimes. One of the first cases they chose to reopen was the murder of Katarzyna Z. For Katarzyna's mother, the 2 decades of silence were an unimaginable ordeal. While the world moved on, her grief remained as immediate and raw as it was in 1999. She never gave up hope for justice. Her quiet, unwavering dignity became a powerful moral force, a constant, silent reminder to law enforcement that her daughter's case could never be truly forgotten. Her persistence was a key reason the case was never allowed to gather dust permanently. The detectives of Archive X began their work with a systematic ground-up review. They approached the case not as a historical puzzle, but as if the crime had happened yesterday, armed with the powerful advantage of 2 decades of hindsight and revolutionary scientific progress. Their first and most critical priority was a full audit of all the original, preserved evidence. Every fiber, every fragment, every slide was to be re-examined. In any cold case, the single most critical factor is the meticulous preservation of the original forensic materials. The diligence of the initial 1999 investigation team in carefully collecting, documenting and storing every piece of evidence according to protocol was now proving to be invaluable. This simple act of procedural diligence was, in effect, an act of hope. It was a bridge built across time, connecting the investigators of the past with the forensic scientists of the future, holding the silent promise that one day technology would catch up to the crime. In 2017, nearly 2 decades after the initial investigation went cold, the case was reopened with fresh eyes and, crucially, new technology. The evidence, meticulously preserved by the Archimex Cold Case Unit, was subjected to a level of scrutiny unimaginable in 1999. The new investigation began in the quiet of the lab, driven by a simple but profound question posed by the detectives to their scientific counterparts. What can we see now that we couldn't see then? The answer lay in the world of microtraces, a field of forensics that had evolved dramatically. Investigators hoped that particles invisible to the naked eye, once dismissed as simple contamination, might now tell their own story. During this painstaking re-examination, the team made a pivotal discovery. Using advanced imaging techniques, they identified minute traces of botanical matter lodged deep within the fibers of the evidence. These were not random debris from the river, but specific identifiable plant fragments, pollen grains, tiny pieces of leaves and spores. Forensic botany, a discipline that uses plant life to solve crimes, was about to provide the investigation with its first major break in 18 years. Each fragment was a potential clue, a silent witness that had clung to the evidence, waiting for the right tools to reveal its secrets. The analysis yielded a remarkable result. The team catalogued a dozen different species, but one in particular stood out. It was a species of ornamental plant, not native to Poland, and in fact extremely rare across all of Europe, typically found only in specialized botanical collections. The presence of this single exotic pollen grain was a statistical anomaly of immense significance. It suggested a link to a very specific, controlled environment, a place far removed from the public parks and riverbanks of Krakow. This was the first significant new lead the case had seen since the turn of the millennium. But it wasn't just the rare plant that was important. It was the unique combination of all the species found. The specific mix of the rare and the common created a unique botanical fingerprint. This ecological profile was like a formula. If investigators could find a physical location where all these plants grew in close proximity, they would have a strong candidate for a key location in the crime. The team began the laborious process of cross-referencing their botanical profile with databases of parks, private gardens, and scientific institutions across the city. The search was no longer for a person, but for a place. The botanical evidence led them directly back to an early person of interest, a name already in the cold case file: Robert Janczewski. The geographical profile generated by the plant evidence pointed squarely to areas he frequented. Janczewski had worked at the Institute of Zoology, an environment where diverse and sometimes exotic biological samples were studied. Furthermore, his known addresses were consistent with the geographical profile. The new science was validating old-fashioned police work, connecting a location to a person with chilling precision. With this new lead, investigators revisited the original FBI profile. It had described a perpetrator with sadistic tendencies, anatomical knowledge, and possible links to martial arts. Janczewski's history, when re-examined, fit the profile with unnerving accuracy. He had a documented history of harassing women. He was a trained martial artist, and most disturbingly, a prior incident involving the mistreatment of lab animals at his workplace suggested a capacity for cruelty and a detached clinical view of anatomy. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent and deeply troubling picture. The accumulation of clues was powerful. The botanical fingerprint, the geographical match, and the alignment with the psychological profile all pointed in one direction. The Archiwum X team now had a single primary suspect. After months of painstaking work, they were ready to act. On the 4th of October 2017, armed with a warrant based on this convergence of new and old evidence, they descended on Robert Janciewski's apartment. The search of the apartment was meticulous. The property had been renovated over the years, but the forensic team was looking for traces that could survive time and cleaning. In the bathroom, they deployed modern chemical reagents like luminol, which can reveal the presence of blood even after nearly 2 decades. In the faint light, the chemical reacted, casting an ethereal blue glow. They had found traces of blood that had been invisible to the naked eye, hidden beneath the layers of time. The samples were carefully collected and rushed to the forensic laboratory for urgent analysis. The question was whether this trace evidence belonged to the victim. The lab technicians extracted a DNA profile from the degraded samples and compared it against the genetic record for Katarzyna Z. The results were conclusive. The DNA matched. For the first time, investigators had direct physical evidence placing the victim inside the suspect's home. Based on the overwhelming weight of the newly discovered evidence, the botanical link, the DNA match, and the corroborating profile, the Krakow police moved to make an arrest. 19 years after Katarzyna Z disappeared from her home, Robert Janciewski was taken into custody, charged with her murder. For the investigators and the victim's family, it seemed the long wait for justice was finally nearing its end. In January 2019, after years of meticulous reinvestigation by Archive X, the case against Robert Janciewski finally moved from the forensic laboratory to the formal adversarial arena of the courtroom. The trial, held at the regional court in Krakow, was set to become one of the most closely watched legal battles in modern Polish history. The weight of 20 years of unanswered questions now rested on the proceedings within these walls. The prosecution, armed with the fruits of a cold case investigation that had pushed the boundaries of forensic science, prepared to present its complex and detailed argument. For the family of Katarzyna Z and for a nation that had followed the case for 2 decades, it was a moment of profound anticipation, a hope that the long, dark road might finally be leading to justice. The prosecution's case was a vast and intricate mosaic. Over the course of the trial, they presented more than 800 pieces of evidence, each one a thread in the narrative they were weaving. Central to their argument were the groundbreaking scientific findings. Botanical experts testified about the rare plant microtraces found on Katarzyna's remains, explaining how they created a botanical fingerprint that, they argued, linked directly back to Janciewski's apartment. Forensic specialists detailed the advanced analysis of the victim's skin, which they claimed bore marks consistent with the suspect's known background in martial arts. The prosecution also leaned heavily on the psychological profile, asserting that Janciewski's personal history, his documented interest in human anatomy, and his past behaviors aligned perfectly with the characteristics of the perpetrator outlined by profilers years earlier. They painted a picture of a calculated and cruel individual, methodically piecing together circumstantial clues to form what they believed was an undeniable conclusion. The defense in turn mounted a formidable challenge. Their core strategy was to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, arguing that it was built entirely on a foundation of circumstantial evidence. They contended that while the volume of evidence was impressive, it lacked a single, definitive, irrefutable link, what is often called a smoking gun. There was no confession, no eyewitness to the crime itself. The DNA evidence found in Janciewski's apartment, they argued, could have been transferred innocently and was not conclusive proof of his involvement in the murder. They systematically questioned the certainty of the botanical evidence, suggesting that such microtraces could be found in other environments and that the link was a matter of probability, not fact. The defense portrayed the prosecution's narrative as a compelling story, but one that ultimately failed to cross the critical threshold required for a criminal conviction. In September 2022, after a trial spanning more than 3 years, the regional court delivered its verdict. The panel of judges found Robert Jankowski guilty of aggravated murder with particular cruelty. He was sentenced to life in prison. For many, it seemed that justice, delayed for so long, had finally been served. The conviction was hailed as a triumph for the cold case unit, a testament to the power of perseverance and modern science. But in the complex world of criminal law, a verdict is often not the final word. Jankowski's legal team immediately filed an appeal, escalating the case to a higher judicial authority. Their argument remained consistent. The standard of proof, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, had not been met by the lower court. They insisted that the circumstantial nature of the evidence left open the possibility of an alternative explanation, and therefore a conviction could not stand. The appeal process began, moving the case into a new phase of intense legal scrutiny, where the focus would shift from the evidence itself to the legal interpretation of that evidence. On the 31st of October 2024, the Krakow Court of Appeal convened to deliver its final, shocking ruling. The court overturned the conviction and acquitted Robert Jankowski. The decision was not a declaration that the evidence was irrelevant, but rather a judgment based on a fundamental principle of law, in dubio pro reo. This ancient Latin phrase, a cornerstone of many legal systems, means when in doubt, for the accused. The appellate judges concluded that while the evidence presented by the prosecution was significant and raised strong suspicions, it did not form an unbroken, airtight chain. It failed to eliminate every other reasonable hypothesis. The court ruled that the collection of circumstantial clues, however compelling, left a sliver of doubt, and in a system where a person's liberty is at stake, that doubt must be resolved in favor of the defendant. Robert Jankowski, having spent 7 years in custody, was declared acquitted under the law and was released. An acquittal is not a declaration of factual innocence. It is a legal finding that the prosecution did not prove its case to the required standard. After a 25-year journey through forensic labs, police archives and courtrooms, the path to justice had led not to a conviction, but to an acquittal. The case of Katarzyna Z, which had seemed so close to being closed, was, once again, officially unsolved. The legal chapter was over, but the mystery endured. The question of who was responsible for her death, which has haunted Poland for a generation, now hangs more heavily in the air than ever before. For the investigators who dedicated years to this case, and for the family that has waited a lifetime for answers, the court's final decision leaves a profound and unsettling void. The story of Katarzyna Z remains a chilling and enduring enigma, a reminder that even with the most advanced science and dedicated police work, the truth can sometimes remain just out of reach. If this investigation moved you, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing. To support our deep dive research and help us continue telling stories that deserve to be heard, you can find a link to our Patreon in the description. Thank you for watching.